Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unraveling one of the absolute most fascinating paradoxes in ancient history. We're looking at a man whose name is practically a household word, a literal towering figure who shaped over 2,000 years of Indian civilization. And yet, his true identity is almost completely obscured in the shadows of time. We're talking about the mysterious genius himself, Patanjali.
Okay, let's dive into this. Because you really have to wonder, how in the world does a single individual influence 2 millennia of human thought, establish foundational texts that we still study globally today, and yet exist as almost a historical ghost? The deeper we dig into his life, the more mysterious the man actually becomes. I mean, modern historians and scholars are still fiercely debating whether he was even a single person.
You see, we're dealing with all these incredibly contradictory identities. Was he a master grammarian who single-handedly perfected classical Sanskrit? Was he a deep-thinking philosopher? Was he the original yogi who laid down a global system for mental liberation? A historian quietly documenting ancient wars? Or maybe a royal priest advising military kings in their royal courts? It reads literally like a historical detective mystery, and to find the real Patanjali, we have to travel back in time.
Part 1. Empire and Turbulence, the 2nd century BCE.
Imagine the situation for a second. We are right in the middle of a massive, civilization-level crisis. The world as people knew it was completely turning upside down. And this brilliantly illustrates how Patanjali wasn't just sitting in some quiet ivory tower, he was right in the center of real, high-stakes political transformation. The mighty Mauryan Empire, which had completely dominated under rulers like Ashoka, had just collapsed. Out of all this uncertainty, a former military commander named Pushyamitra Shunga violently overthrew the last Mauryan ruler and seized power. And if that wasn't stressful enough, there was the constant rising threat of foreign invasions from the Indo-Greeks, known as the Yavanas.
Right in the middle of all this turmoil, a brilliant mind emerged. Now, Patanjali's actual origins are deeply debated. Some traditions say he was born in Gonarda, near modern Uttar Pradesh, while other accounts actually link him down to South India. But while his birth is a total mystery, his education is undeniable. This guy was part of a highly trained intellectual elite. He mastered grammar, ancient Vedic traditions, philosophy, logic, and the incredibly complex ritual sciences. In ancient India, having this specific level of education meant you were operating at the absolute highest tier of the knowledge culture.
Moving to Part 2, Grammar as a Science, or basically the code of reality.
So, Patanjali's unparalleled education led him to write his absolute masterpiece, the Mahabhashya. Now, before your eyes glaze over at the word grammar, we need to completely reframe what grammar meant in ancient India. We're not talking about boring schoolbook rules here. It was, quite literally, the science of thought, the code of reality. To really get what Patanjali did, we have to look at the genius who came before him, Panini. Think of Panini's foundational text, the Astadhyayi, like complex computer code. Modern linguists actually compare Panini's grammatical rules to mathematical algorithms. Brilliant for sure, but highly condensed and super difficult to process. Well, Patanjali took that brilliant raw code and transformed it into a living, breathing philosophical operating system. He didn't just mechanically explain the rules. He explored the psychology of language itself.
And what makes the Mahabhashya feel so incredibly alive even today is his dynamic, almost scientific teaching method. He doesn't just stand there and demand blind acceptance from his students. No. He actively asks scientific questions. He purposely raises critical objections, imagines where a student might get confused, creates a vibrant debate right there on the page, and only then arrives at the truth. This rigorous, analytical, Socratic style of questioning is exactly why modern scholars still admire him so deeply today.
All right, Part 3. Politics and Sacred Rituals.
But you see, Patanjali wasn't just a teacher of language. Let's shift our investigation to his alleged role as a Purohita, or royal priest, during the newly established Shunga dynasty. Which begs a really critical question. Pushyamitra Shunga was a hardcore military commander who seized an empire by force. Why on earth would a military king need a grammar nerd in his royal court? The answer to that reveals the deep, fascinating interconnectedness of language, religion, and state power.
Here's the deal. Pushyamitra desperately wanted to legitimize his new rule by reviving ancient Vedic traditions, specifically the Ashwamedha, or the horse sacrifice. Now, this wasn't just some quaint religious ceremony. This was a massive, high-stakes political declaration of absolute sovereignty. And the stakes couldn't have been higher because India's sacred traditions were transmitted orally. If you performed this massive ritual and made even one single wrong pronunciation, you would literally change the meaning of the sacred recitation, ruin the ritual, and effectively collapse the entire political and spiritual statement. Pushyamitra didn't just need soldiers anymore. He desperately needed an absolute master of sacred grammar and ritual precision. Basically, he needed Patanjali.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Patanjali actually, totally accidentally, became a historian. Ancient India didn't always provide straightforward chronological history books, but tucked away right inside Patanjali's grammatical examples in the Mahabhashya are literal historical clues. He casually mentions the Yavanas, or Greeks, invading certain towns. He references the contemporary political tensions, social hierarchies, and the revival of Brahminical rituals under the Shungas. Historians today literally use his grammar textbook as a priceless primary source to reconstruct the obscure timeline of post-Mauryan India. How cool is that?
Which brings us to part 4, the great yoga debate.
Because just when we think we finally have Patanjali figured out, okay, brilliant grammarian, advising kings, and accidentally recording history, we hit a major complication in our historical mystery. And this is the center of a fierce modern debate among scholars. Ancient traditions firmly identify Patanjali as the author of the legendary Yoga Sutras. But wait a minute, is the man who wrote the ultimate massive commentary on language the exact same individual who wrote the foundational text on silencing the mind? Was the master of language also the master of silence? Well, some scholars say absolutely yes, pointing to a unified, once-in-a-generation genius. But others argue no, suggesting that different scholars over several centuries simply shared the revered name of Patanjali.
Honestly, regardless of the authorship debate, the Yoga Sutras attributed to him completely changed the world. Just take a second to absorb this incredibly foundational quote, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the stopping of the fluctuations of the mind. That single, profoundly serene text became the absolute global pillar for mental discipline, deep concentration, meditation, and spiritual liberation.
And finally, part 5, preserving a civilization.
Let's move to and see how this builds into the modern era. Because whether he was one single man or represented a whole lineage of brilliant minds, the legacy attributed to the name Patanjali entirely shatters a very common myth. You know, people often imagine ancient civilizations as being purely mythological or mystical. Patanjali proves without a doubt that ancient India possessed rigorous, cutting-edge, analytical, and scientific traditions. Just look at his incredible modern impact. In linguistics, his analysis of syntax and semantics anticipated concepts that modern science only rediscovered centuries later. In yoga, he provided the foundational philosophy for a practice that is currently used by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And in history, his texts serve as a vital primary source for understanding an incredibly turbulent, transformative political era.
Patanjali's work intersected with literally every major aspect of ancient Indian civilization. He provided the exact pronunciation needed for religion, the scholarly legitimacy required for dynastic politics, the grammatical structure central to all higher education, the profound philosophy connecting human language to fundamental reality, and the standardization that preserved classical Sanskrit culture itself. He wasn't just preserving words and syllables, he was acting as the literal bedrock, preserving the foundational pillars of Indian civilization.
You know, we may never fully solve the mystery of exactly who Patanjali was, where he was born, or if he alone penned every single masterpiece bearing his name. But honestly, perhaps that doesn't matter. The Mauryas fell, the Shungas vanished, the Indo-Greeks disappeared. Massive, powerful empires collapsed into dust. But Patanjali's ideas, his precise grammar, his philosophy of mind, they survived it all. They outlasted the swords and the crowns. And that leaves us with a really provocative thought to walk away with. If the deepest truths of a civilization are carried not by its armies, but by its words and its intellect, what ideas are we preserving today that will outlast our own era? Because that is the enduring power of language. That is true immortality. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep your curiosity alive.